Welcome everybody to this Zoom talk by the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. We've been doing this for a year and a half. When we started way back in March 2020, I never imagined we could keep going for so long. We've had so many wonderful presentations. Today, our speaker is Beatrice Olivastri. She's the CEO of Friends of the Earth Canada. Now, Friends of the Earth Canada is just one of 75 national Friends of the Earth. And so Bea really is a citizen of the world linked to many other citizens of the world and really fits in really well at KCOR, where I think we are also citizens of the world. The four themes that Friends of the Earth in Canada is working on at the moment are climate change and energy, and that certainly connects with KCOR, environmental justice, water and plastics, and Bea's topics today, the Bee cause. And she has a way with words the same as many of us. If you visit the FOE website, you will find a wonderful little tagline in their section on climate change and energy. And it reads, "Oh, Canada, we've got to do better." And I think Bea is probably going to tell us today one wonderful example of where we have started to do better. And I hope that spills over into all the other talks. Bea, over to you.
Thank you, John. I'm not going to promise to be wildly optimistic, but somewhat. But thank you for this opportunity. And I'm really delighted to see so many people that I have worked with in the past and whose leadership has made it possible for Friends of the Earth to be involved in things like stratospheric ozone, and more recently, things to do with pesticides and coated seeds and other issues. So I'm a lifer with Friends of the Earth. I helped to set it up in Canada in 1978. I was on the board for a number of years. And then about 25 years ago, started working there as the chief executive officer. And I occasionally describe that as chief cook and bottle washer. Since, as those of you who know NGOs will know, that we end up being involved in all kinds of tasks in our work. As John mentioned, Friends of the Earth globally has grown. It's a fairly distinct organization in that it's organized from the grassroots up. The 75 Friends of the Earth national organizations work with a secretariat that support us. We do not have a corporate head office. And we have a very engaging 2 weeks of work every 2 years to decide on the global work on which we collaborate. Other than that, each country is its own organization to decide on the priorities that will suit their constituency in their own country. I found it amazingly engaging and also shocking and horrifying on the human rights side. And I'll just share with you one of my, I guess, really heartfelt takeaways from one of the meetings I was at with Friends of the Earth International, where at the time the director of Friends of the Earth Indonesia described her, she was a medical doctor, described her safety strategy as the leader of a very diverse network in Indonesia dealing with gold miners, Canadian gold miners in that case, dealing with government issues and so on. She had to have an exit strategy that within hours could take her husband and children away to safety should she be put in jail or assassinated. This was a number of years ago, but it's still the case that many of our global friends who are trying to protect the things we work to protect in Canada, but in their circumstances, they're taking their life in their hands to do that kind of work. So again, I find it's been a privilege to work here in Canada, and with those of you with whom I've had some collaboration in the past. I guess as I get a bit older, I reflect on what a privilege it's been to do this work in Canada. So let me move on to the topic of the day, because I think it's perhaps one of the most heartfelt areas of work since acid rain. And I'm sure you all remember acid rain work, which somehow touched so many Canadians, perhaps because we care so much about clean, safe water and the things that inhabit it, but also air issues. So acid rain seemed to bring together so many different issues. The work around what we call saving the bees, and our program is called the Bee Cause, I think touches even more people than that campaign did. And I speculate that it has to do with, for many of us, some kind of rural roots where we have relatives who kept bees, perhaps on farms. And then more recently, younger people, I think it's understanding and connecting the role of pollinators with food security. And I think food security is a clear and present issue of concern for people globally, but certainly for many Canadians of all ages. We did some polling at Friends of the Earth to try and understand what Canadians cared about and knew about bees. This is about 5 years ago, but it's funny how some polls get recycled, and we've had PhD candidates working with the polling data 5 years, 4 years after the fact. But this was to try and put a benchmark in place to consider, where the Canadian public was on the question of bees. And the first thing we did is try to distinguish to what extent people understood that there were honeybees and there are wild native bees, two distinct areas, two distinct pots of bees and issues. And I have to say that in that particular poll, very few people knew anything about bees other than honeybees, and a few were aware of bumblebees. Nevertheless, there was incredibly strong readings on how much people cared about bees, how important they felt it was that government play a strong role to protect bees. And then for us, just a clear message that a great deal of education was in order so that people would understand how important wild native bees are. Not to take away from how important honeybees are and the role they play, but as I have said so many times, they have beekeepers to take care of their interests. Wild native bees have, fortunately, some amazing scientists, but other than that, no dedicated personnel to take care of their interests in terms of the protection that's required. And so those of us in environmental groups like Friends of the Earth and many others in Canada are trying to work with people in their own communities to do what we can to save the bees. So our program is called the Bee Cause, and we have designed and delivered it with our colleagues in the UK and also in the United States, 3 countries that have had the range of issues from pesticide concerns to climate to basically the 4 concerns around bees, which would be, sorry, I'm just blanking out there for a minute. I should know them all off by heart. So pesticides, climate change. All right, Pierre, help me. Missing my 3rd and 4th. All right, I'll come back to that. Habitat loss. Well, everybody starts with habitat loss and pathogens. So I don't know to what extent people on the call have any background in bees, so I'm just going to skip through some basics and hope that if you already know this, you will forgive me. I won't take very long on that, but we have in the world 25,000 different bee species, maybe more than that now. And in Canada, I'm not the scientist, Friends of the Earth isn't employing the scientists, but we understand there were in the order of 800, maybe now more, maybe now 900 bee species in Canada. These are the wild native bees. We're not counting the honeybees in these numbers. And the best known out of these wild native bees would be the bumblebees, and there are more than 45 species of bumblebees. Just as a little side note, the scientists in Canada are still discovering new species of bees, and one discovered last year has been named after astronaut Chris Hadfield, which I thought was kind of neat. But then to distinguish them a bit more, most of the wild native bees are solitary in nature. And that means that they conduct their nest building, their food gathering, tending for the young by themselves. Bumblebees, however, so that 45 to 50 out of the 800 or 900, bumblebees live in a colony. They're considered social. And so they have 150 to 200 in typically the ground, an old rodent hole. So they're ground nesting. And I just want you to remember ground nesting, because there are connections in the future then with issues around soil, pesticides in the soil, and all the things we're going to do, not in my talk about soil carbon. Keep remembering how important it is that the soil is healthy and not killing the very important wild native bees that we have. So then what I want to talk about is that bumblebees in particular, again, the longest span in terms of the seasons. This will be important when we talk about climate issues. So the queen bee is hibernating over the winter, and she comes out early in the spring, depending on what part of the country you're in, quite early, March or April, very hungry, looking for pollen, looking to set up a new nest. And typically we don't have a lot of pollinating, pollen-bearing flowers out that early in the spring. But anyway, she gets on with it, builds the nest, has more bees, has a couple of queens that are tended. And then by late fall, all of those bees, except for the new queen, are gone, are toast, fulfill their life cycle, and then the new queens hibernate for the next season. So you've got from sort of March, April into October. I saw some bumblebees last November. Very long life cycle. So as we talk about weather impact and so on, they're in the radar screen for impact on climate change. So in Canada, when we're thinking about how to address the question of saving bees, we look at what the federal government can and should be doing. And over the last number of years, say 2014, when many of the environmental and conservation groups started working on specifically on saving the bees, we looked at what the Pest Management Regulatory Agency was doing around pesticides. And what was triggering a lot of the new interest at that time was a collection of incident reports in Canada, I guess maybe starting in 2012 and peaking in 2013, about massive bee die-offs. We've heard more about this in the States subsequently, but for Canada, it was around the planting season and masses of honeybees, which were counted, wild native bees weren't being counted. Dying off from impact with the coating, so the powder from the coating of pesticides on the seeds. If anyone's maybe not been around a rural area, when seeds are being planted now, it's high pressure injection. And so if you have a coated seed, only a small percentage of the actual coating, which is a pesticide typically called a neonicotinoid pesticide, only a small part of it ends up in the ground, in the soil with seed, however powerful that is. But a lot would be coming off from the high injection energy. And in that case, bee hits powder with the pesticide in it. It's like acutely lethal, they're dead. So that triggered a great deal of concern. The beekeepers were particularly, of course, outspoken. I give my hat to the Ontario beekeepers because they did amazing work to provide reports and to learn, as we all were learning at the time, about what these chemicals were. So they were a suite of pesticides that were supposed to be, when they were introduced, less destructive than earlier pesticides. And they were widely used pesticides, typically used prophylactically, which means, hey, just in case I need them, let's use them everywhere. As opposed to a treatment that's used because an infestation is identified. So at that point, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency took on a huge mission of special reviews on the neonics, and it coincided with the time they would do regulatory reviews anyway. In Canada, every 15 years, registered pesticide is re-evaluated. So you had a whole suite of reports looking at the safety, basically, of this suite of pesticides called neonicotinoids. So there also were any number of organizations and people, communities taking steps to either go neonic free, to set up pollinator gardens, to, you know, from that period on to now, it's continuing. And it's, as I said, an amazing response by people of all ages and communities to do what they can to save the bees. But when you think about what the federal government, what their role is, what Canada did not do and other countries were doing and still are doing is put in place a pollinator protection policy. I may say that because we didn't, maybe if we would do it now, we'd get it right. Most of the other countries that did put these in place, like a Pollinator Protection Act in the UK, ended up focusing in particular on honeybees as opposed to the wild native bees. So anyway, we have not yet managed to see any kind of comprehensive plan or protection for bees. What we do have, though, and we're just completing now a review of all the federal and provincial and territorial regulations to see what might be there to protect bees. It's not finished, so I can't really share it with you just because it's not finished yet. But it does look at, on the federal level, the fact that we have species at risk. And that act has now been used for 9 species of bees. 1 is a sweat bee, 8 are bumblebees. And for the first time last year, 1 was listed, and it is the suckly cuckoo bumblebee, which is across Canada except in Nunavut, because of impact of pathogens from managed colonies in commercial greenhouses, big issue. Pesticide use, the neonics I mentioned, and first time ever, climate change. I am getting climate change. So the Species at Risk Act can provide some protection for different levels, as probably many of you know, but I describe it as an act that's there to be used when bees are already dead and dying. I don't find that rates as a pollinator protection policy or act. And then the other thing that's at the federal level is a voluntary instrument. It's a national bee farm level biosecurity standard put together without any of the scientists I know working in this area, but somewhat industry driven, let's call it. And they describe it as practical guidance for owners dealing with the 3 main Canadian bee sectors: honeybees, alfalfa leaf cutting bees, and bumblebees. What they mean are domesticated bees, though. And it's trying to offer the management practices that will minimize disease-causing pathogens, parasites, insect pests, and so on. All of which, I might add, are critters that can be can have climate, let's say, additional impact because of climate change. That standard and the species at risk and the pest, so the Pest Control Products Act is what is used by the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. All of you who've had anything to do with government knows this is an alphabet soup. But the Pest Control Products Act is, while it's supposed to provide action with precaution, and it's supposed to address human health and environmental concerns, the way I would describe it is a market entry instrument for pesticide manufacturers. So I would share with many of my colleagues in the environmental groups working on bees, high level of dissatisfaction with the role of PMRA. What I think we need to be looking at is a formal program or policy to protect wild native pollinators, and I'll mention what it is that we're proposing in that briefly in a few minutes. But first, so John gave me a challenge when we talked about this, about bringing climate change in. And I have to say, even when I described those 4 stressors, I usually remember them, climate change is always in that list, but seldom seen in terms of the research that's going on. And as I said, for the first time listed as a contributing cause of an endangered species. And that's a cuckoo bee that lives in the nests of other bees. And so the fact that it's declined so much, over 30%, means that its host bumblebees have also declined, and they're using climate as one of the contributing factors. Now, the first time climate came to our notice was back in 2015, and a scientist named Jeremy Kerr at Ottawa U, who some of you might know, with some colleagues, published a report that, and I'm just going to describe it generally, but what they were doing is using amazing amount of data from 110 years in North America and in the UK. And they were assessing where the species were shifting. And basically they were saying that unlike many species, I'm sure you've heard before about birds that are moving north, plants such as trees moving north, and climate is a factor for that to happen. For the bumblebee species, which is what they were studying, they saw very little movement. And so they were trying to assess what was going on independent of landscapes changing. So that means areas that used to be meadows being put into corn and soy farming, for example, which has been a big habitat loss factor in Ontario, as an example. So their work, and I'm just fascinated with what they did and how we, the public, need to do more to help scientists like this. But they put together a database of 423,000 observations on 67 European and North American bumblebee species. And they put it together from all kinds of different data. And basically they were measuring how much change has there been in North America, which is about 2,000 native bees, wild native bees in North America together. So which ones, this is bumblebee specifically though, which ones were moving north, which ones were moving south? So for climate impact, the theory is species will move north or south to move away from the heat. What they found is some change in the southern range, but nothing in the north. And so there's an inability of these bumblebees to, for whatever reason, to replicate what other species are doing and move northward. They did some work to make sure that they were not encountering impacts created by the use of neonics. So they were looking at the neonic pesticides I mentioned earlier. So they were looking at range losses that occurred before neonics were introduced, which I'm thinking is about 20 years ago. They first started in North America, roughly. So the concern here is that these are cold, bumblebees tolerate cool temperatures very well, and they're fixed in their location. These locations are suffering more and more intense temperatures, and there is and will be, speaking back in 2015, going to be a climate impact as a result on these bees. Now, Professor Kerr and his colleagues, other colleagues, went on to do an additional piece of work that came out about a year ago. And they, in that case, so what they were looking at is tracking the increasing number of days of extreme heat again, looking at North American and European bumblebees, and their findings are suggesting an increasing local rate of extinction. Again, looking at the sites and where the bees are and species richness, how many of the bees there are in a particular area. So they see again the extreme temperatures, but also the increased precipitation starting to certainly be vastly more than what the bees were used to in these historic ranges, and having an impact on potential extinction. Just quickly, a couple of more, I'm checking the time here. A couple of researchers out of Toronto were talking about, we're tracking the changes in size, body sizes of the bees, and whether or not they could attribute this change in body sizes to climate change. And they were looking at a small carpenter bee, so one of the many, many bees making up our wild native bees. And they were looking at how the bodies of these bees have changed in the past 118 years. Again, amazing data sets that they somehow figured out how to work with. 118 years on climate change, 45 years on what was happening in terms of agriculture and urban cover. And looking as well at how some summer temperatures had increased over this time frame. They found that both male and female sizes were decreasing with the temperature increase, but with agricultural expansion, the male size decreased and the female size increased. So how these differences correlate is an interesting question, but they're saying they're framing them as opposing pressures acting concurrently and projecting that it will result in bee extinction from agricultural habitats at some point. Anyway, their takeaway is that we really can't study just one part of this collection of stressors. We have to find a way to look at and consider how they are interacting and making sure that climate change is studied within that collection. This one, looking at the effects of weather and climate and linking the difference in precipitation patterns with, remember I mentioned the queen bees coming out in the spring, so more precipitation, perhaps less flowers, less pollen, the hungry queen bee starting up the year, less available food, and so on. And then finally, some group of scientists that did a review of literature. They looked at genetics and species at a community level, species diversity. And it was funny because their piece of work is saying they felt climate change is expected to drive biodiversity loss in the future, but they felt that the current warming is often being considered positive, having positive impacts on pollinators in the northern region of the globe. So their review on genetics, species, and community level diversity suggested otherwise, and that in fact, the climate change is making pollinators less resilient. So you start to add up, no matter what PMRA says, neonics have an impact on pollinators, on their systems, on their learning, on their reproduction, you name it. And then you have climate having an impact on the resilience of the bees, access to food, change in morphology, and then you add in the pathogens and the escaping pathogens from greenhouses, from domesticated bumblebees out to wild bumblebees, on and on and on. We have a crisis here. And so climate may be, it's not that it's new, but it may be, by looking at climate with some increased emphasis and urgency, that we find a way to bring climate forward as the concern about saving the bees and factor in these other issues, and finally trigger a pollinator protection program, preferably policy by government. I believe that the research community has moved in amazing ways with very limited resources to do a lot of work that we certainly didn't have back in 2014 when we were all starting to look at this issue as campaigners. But I guess the thing is we've got to consider climate as a fresh way. We're not going to stop saying we believe neonics and other systematic pesticides should be banned, because we do believe that. But maybe there's a way to bring this collection of issues together under a climate chapeau. And look at the effect on bee life cycles, look at how we can work with the farm communities, cities, which are increasingly being seen as a refuge for wild bees, a place where, because of the cosmetic pesticide bans, there's little pesticide use, and people who are watering and taking care of flowers, the floral resources. So it's a little bit of a cushion around some of the climate issues they might encounter in the wild. I mentioned a couple of times the amazing data these researchers put together over many years, many resources. And that's just so that I could come back to say to you how important I think it is to have the citizen science programs that are operating now as well supported as possible. One of the scientists I mentioned, Jeremy Kerr, has been part of setting up Bumblebee Watch, but also Butterfly Watch. And I think that this kind of data is, there are other programs as well, but this, iNaturalist being one of them, this kind of data is going to be used by scientists into the future, but it is now too. And so I think the more that we can engage the public, the better. And on that note, we're having a look now at how our schools are educating young people about wild native bees. And it's sad, most of them know about honeybees from the Cheerios and General Foods promos, which when they first started were giving out the wrong kind of seeds. But anyway, so there's a lot of work to do in that education area. But just to leave you with this news, I guess, we're working as part of something called the Green Budget Coalition that brings together 23 of the major environmental groups in Canada to put all of our best ideas and wants and desires together on strategic, fiscal, and budgetary items. In other words, we present the government with what we'd like them to deliver in every budget year. We do it in advance of a budget. And for the last several years, we have asked them to support a Canadian native pollinator initiative. We went back to a number of years ago when there was a program called Can Pollen, supported by NSERC. It only lasted 5 years. It was, I thought, an amazing initiative, bringing together scientists from all over the country. And of course, after 5 years, you're really just getting started in a lot of the collaborative work. So it was very sad to see that funding cut off. But so we're looking for federal government support for scientists. We're looking for engagement for people of all ages and backgrounds, a pollinator monitoring fund, and anyway, a number of other programs and operational capacity that certainly Environment Canada should have, but other agencies as well. So we're not content to leave this to Agriculture Canada and their approach to turning wild native bees into domesticated little robots. And we want to see an environmental pollinator policy put in place. And that's what we'll continue to work on with our colleagues. I guess that's what I want to cover. I think the shifting is somewhat opportunistic in that we all know we all have to do everything we can in climate change going forward. And so to have more of a climate focus is both correct at this point, but also I think timely in that that's where so many governments are looking to develop their work. But that doesn't mean we give up on the toxic work at all. And if anyone's interested in the history and ongoing work around 3-tongue twisting neonics, I'd be happy to talk about the work we've done in market campaigns, changing what the nurseries and big box stores sell, and also the legal action that we've taken to try and get those pesticides banned. I think that's what I'd like to start with to share, but I'll be looking forward to the conversation now.
Thank you very much, Bea. And may I ask everybody on this call, if you have a question or comment you'd like to offer in this conversation, please send a message to everyone from the chat button in the middle at the bottom of your screen. So Bea, without pollinators, the rest of life would be very difficult. Are there any examples of complete failures of pollination that affect Homo sapiens, which finally really isn't as sapiens as all that?
So, you know, in the last decade, as lots of Save the Bee campaigns were being developed, someone decided to use a quote from Einstein that was not from Einstein, saying, you know, without bees, we'll all be dead, whatever. That's not the case. What we do know is that without pollination, we will not have the quality of fruits, seeds, plants that we have now. So pollination is essential. I don't know if you've ever seen at the same time, there were all kinds of posters going around that showed like little gnarly strawberries against a big, healthy, plump strawberry saying, with pollination, without pollination. So it's essential to the production of fruits and seeds. It doesn't mean it's impossible. There could be some wind pollination. There could be some, you know, ants, flies, you know, there's all kinds of pollinators, by the way. The most important, we believe, is wild native bees, but there are many pollinators, bats, moths, wasps even. Nobody likes them, but they're pollinators. So I can't give you an example of, you know, no pollinators, zero, nothing. It's more that they are important for productivity.
Thank you. Jean Doherty, and anybody else who comes in this conversation, please unmute yourself and let us see your face.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk, Beatrice. At the very end, you made comment about the work that your group has been doing with respect to trying to reduce the use of neonics and different things. And I was wondering if you could give a more detailed update as to what's going on. I thought that that legislation was actually put through, and it sounds like it's not. So can you give us an update, please?
Sure. So it isn't really legislation that's going on. Ontario, a number of years ago, did bring in an amendment to its Pesticide Act. And what it did is it classified coated seeds as a pesticide and called for a number of measures, including an independent assessor, have to show that there was an infestation before farmers could use the neonics. That actually got put aside by Premier Ford's government. And it also called for some different kind of reporting on the sales of the pesticide. Nobody in Canada is required to report on the use of the pesticide like they do in California, for example, which has always been a problem. So besides that, in Ontario, federally, it was reviews, special reviews of neonics and their impacts on pollinators. And then I think I described it as every 15 years, there is a reevaluation required by law of a registered pesticide. And so PMRA has reported on all of that work underway. So clothianidin, thiamethoxam, imidacloprid, and impacts on pollinators. The same three under their reevaluation. And then a new one came in on the same Neonics on squash bees. That was a special review saying, because that squash bee is a ground nesting bee, very important, I thought, to have that work done. What were the impacts of those pesticides, same three, on the squash bee? And so in every case, PMRA has taken some modest measures. They have not chosen to ban anything. They have reduced, they have relabeled, they've taken 2 or 3 years just to relabel in some cases. They have removed the usage in some. My understanding, this is off the record, guys, but my understanding is there were proposals put out through the farmers networks, through provincial ag offices, saying, here's what we're looking at doing. Tell us what you can live without, so that they would have a way of saying, okay, we're going to reduce these uses, but we're going to leave you with the things you say you can't live without. So we ended up with this amazing hodgepodge of, as I said, you know, different labeling, as if you can. And anyway, I won't go into labeling, but so we have had very little, I would say, overall success in removing neonics. At the same time, there are newer systemic products. So that's one of the things I didn't mention about neonics. There's systemic pesticide, which means once it's applied, either as a coating or as a spray, foliar treatment, ground drench, whatever, it's absorbed by the whole plant. So it's in the soil, it's in the stems, it's in the leaves, it's in the flower, it's in the nectars and the pollen. So that exposure is a particularly negative thing. And so the newer pesticides that are being introduced are systemic as well. So even if we finally get the neonics banned, we're still going to have systemic pesticides of some sort to deal with. So, you know, this is the frustrating thing about working on this kind of work and working with PMRA. So I'm not sure what I said that led you to think there was a law that we were trying to pass. We want a policy. I'd be happy with the Pollinator Act, but all of this work has been around the use of these three neonics, and it has been frustrating. So we also went to court several times to try and, well, challenge the decision that was being made by PMRA, and we lost every time. But yeah, you know, I've been litigating for 20 years in Friends of the Earth on different issues, and it's the first time we ever had to pay a pesticide company expenses from a court case. So, wow, not happy.
Yeah, thank you for that. What you didn't directly say anything about laws, but what I remember was from a few years ago when it really started to hit the news that there was a lot of toing and froing, especially, you know, that they were going to try and put in an act in, I think it might have just been Ontario, and then the corn, in particular, the corn farmers got their themselves organized, and so I was just wondering. That's, you've given an update.
You're right. You're right. I think it was discussed as an act, but what it actually was the amendment of Ontario's pesticide regulation. That's what it ended up being, you know, functionally.
Excellent.
And you're right, the corn farmers, the grain farmers, they set up a war room to oppose this work. They were quite enraged.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Art Hunter, you're on board. Off you go.
Yeah, I guess we're very interested in our birds in our neighborhood and as a householder, and we put feeders up in the spring, and once everything is functioning in nature, we don't feed the birds anymore. They're quite happy to function with nature, but they need a helping hand in the spring. We also have birdhouses. What can we do for bees? Is there such a way, some way we can give them a spring helping hand? and possibly even throughout the year, not really upset nature in any way.
Absolutely, lots of things. There's a free, beautiful book on the rusty patch bumblebee and pollinator gardens on our website. You can download it at no cost. It was written by a gardening writer and a scientist, Sheila Kola, with the City of Toronto. So it's got a little bit more of a GTA focus, but lots of good stuff for anywhere in the country. So it's the pollinator patch for the rusty patch bumblebee, but more to the point, seasonally. So we're in the fall. One of the things you want to do is don't cut down all the plants that have reedy stems. So you want to leave. I'm giving you permission to have a messy garden because it'll be good for bees. Don't clean everything up and compost everything in sight, because many of these solitary bees have their eggs in the reeds, like say raspberry canes, for example, or whatever collection of flowers or shrubs that you have. And so we kind of call that let it be in the fall. And then in the spring, you want to put off mowing as long as you can. So there was a campaign called Don't Mow or something like that in the spring. And of course, neighbors being what they are, sometimes they don't see this in the same light as someone who loves bees. But if you can put off mowing in the spring, as long as you can, there's little, if you look, you might see little violets or other little flowering plants in your lawns that are so helpful in the spring. As I said, first out species in the spring are hungry, not a lot of pollen available. So if there are crocus, if there's a willow tree, if there are little violets, all of these things help the early pollinators. In general, that gardening book I just mentioned has all kinds of pictures and sort of layouts of gardens, but planting a pollinator garden is a wonderful thing to do. Basically, we're suggesting colors that are attractive to bees. And just a rule of thumb is you want, like, if you can, a cluster of 3 or 5 things, because that's more attractive to bees than a single plant here, there, and wherever. So planting native plants would be the thing to do in the summer. So I know all kinds of other plants or flowering plants can be beautiful, but native plants tend to have a single blossom. Most bees can get at the nectar and pollen that way. You get the more hybrid kind of plants that are gorgeous, of course, but it's more difficult. And that's the other thing, by the way. Let's say you want to plant sunflowers. Make sure you get sunflowers with pollen. The pollen's been bred out of many of the sunflowers. People think it's messy, but sunflowers that have pollen is another good thing to plant along with native species. Just a few things, but have a look at the website and get the handbook for the rusty patch bumblebee flower patches. Anyway, you'll see it on the homepage. You can order it.
Okay. Yeah, could somebody put the URL into chat so that'll be on our record?
It's,
Yes. The Friends of the Earth, the URL is very simple: foecanada.org.
I just put it up there.
And that can be put in.
If you go through the banner at the top of the homepage, I think there's somewhere where you can click. When I say order, it just means you have to click to do the download. There's no cost involved in it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Peter Bulkowski, please. You have 2 questions, I think. Why don't you pose both of them?
Okay, the two questions were what's happening in the rest of the world in terms of areas with high and increasing human populations, such as Africa, India, Bangladesh, China, because there's clearly massive disruption of soil and habitat in those areas occurring. The second question is back to Canada or the West, and what's happening to wasp populations?
Okay, I can't tell you about the wasp population. So can look into it, send you back an email, but it isn't something I'm up on. Maybe someone like Pierre has some data on that. On other countries, especially in developing countries, you know, China is an interesting case in point. You may remember going back to the 50s and 60s where they basically killed off all the bees with pesticides, and you know, this was to stop pollution from bird droppings and whatever else. So now they hand pollinate. This is sort of the classic story about, you know, you, for whatever reason, you wipe out your insects, as we know, insect apocalypse that I didn't mention yet today, but anyway, you're going to end up with a void where you don't have their services. So the classic story about China is with the huge amount of inexpensive human power they have, there's a trend towards, or a need to do hand pollination in farming. But that's not unlike in the East Coast. If you remember the spruce budworm and other kinds of forestry issues, I would include glyphosate, for example, where they spray the hell out of the forest. They have very few wild bees, and guess what blueberries need? They need pollinators. So they rent honeybees from Ontario and truck them down to the Maritimes for pollination services, cranberries, blueberries. Not that easy on the bees, but that's very similar to, as I said, the situation in China where they've wiped out so many of their insects, they have to replace those services. You know, we've dealt with some of our colleagues and Friends of the Earth groups in Africa on pollinators, and it doesn't seem to have the, I'm going to say the concern around pesticides that we have at this point. Kind of reminds me of other issues. Something Vic will remember around methyl bromide. Years ago, we did some work in Ghana and other countries. There was no methyl bromide being used on squashes and whatever. A couple of years later, there's money to do some work. And guess what? In comes the methyl bromide. I think it might be similar. They're not huge markets at this point for the neonics, but I wouldn't be surprised if they end up there, whether it's this generation or the next generation of the systemic pesticides. And again, in China, imidacloprid, which is the longest standing, longest used neonic in Canada and the States, imidacloprid is off patent now. So we're seeing it being produced in large quantities in China and also being used there. And I don't know any more than that. I know our colleagues in South America have been looking at some of the pesticide issues, but I guess we've had more to do with European and a couple of the African countries. They're more looking at, I guess, a range of agricultural issues, not necessarily bees and neonics.
Thank you, Bea. Jeff Passmore, would you like to make your observation?
Hi, Bea. Been quite a few years since we've seen each other, but nice to see you again. And by the way, separate from my comment, I had no idea that there were 45 species of bumblebees in Canada. I'll have to start paying more attention to the bumblebees in our yard because we get quite a few of them. Thank goodness we have endless number of flowering plants, some annuals and some perennials, but and I'm always having to rescue bees at this time of year in particular out of the swimming pool. I don't know why they commit hara-kiri, but they seem to fly into the pool. But my comment or question was more for, I guess, Jean and other members of the board. You mentioned some NGOs that are collaborating to bring this issue to the attention of governments, and particularly the federal government. And I'm just thinking that, and we can bring this up, Jean, at the next board meeting, but it might be something, and my question to you, I guess, B, would be, is there a mechanism whereby KCOR could lend its support to this issue that you're focusing on of a pollinator policy? Because as you point out, it is a food security issue, which is something, of course, that KCOR and CORE are interested in.
So what I was referring to was the Green Budget Coalition, and our annual product, our report of recommendations for the government will be public very shortly. it's like the minute a budget is out, we start working on the next report of proposals. So this is for next spring. You know, it could be very interesting if you would be interested in looking at those recommendations. You might find many climate ones you're interested in, but go to the back and look at the pollinator recommendation. Don't just look at all the other ones. They're all interesting though. You could lend your support with a message to the finance committee when, you know, if you were inclined to send a letter to the finance committee. This is where, of course, the budgetary consultations will happen, or to any MPs that represent you as individuals, but using your association overall to support these kind of things. We take this collection of recommendations around to all the relevant ministers, the deputies. We meet with the policy staff before and after we meet with the ministers. So there's a lot of lobbying that goes on. I'm sorry, advocacy to support this. Anyway, so depending on what your interaction is with any particular MPs or ministers, I mean, this would be great. We have a little chart that shows which relevant departments go with which recommendation. So that sometimes helps to know where to focus. Remember how sometimes the general public doesn't know which level of government or which department to focus on when they want to advocate, but you guys are all pros, so I know you would know that.
Jeff threw out really a sort of a challenge to Jean Doherty, who's chair of the KCOR board at the moment. So Jean, I think you might like to answer that.
Well, answer is not quite the right way, but I do think Jeff is onto something. And I think that it certainly is well worth considering whether or not we would link up with you and with some of the other groups or try to get the information and support what you're doing. So yes, it's certainly well worth discussing at one of the next board meetings. Yeah, thank you.
Beatrice, can you, when this report comes out, send us the link?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that would be great.
So thank you, Jean. Victor Buxton, you have a question or a comment.
Yes.
I'd like to turn your picture on.
I can't turn off my video because you've got me muted on video.
Really? You can do that yourself.
Showing is it's muted and I can't unmute it.
Okay. Okay,
There we
just
go
go ahead
now.
anyway.
There you are.
Ah, there we see
There we
the
go.
beautiful Vic.
I've really got two comment and an observation. One, a friend of mine in Saskatchewan happens to own a fertilizer company. And he was telling me about a new startup company called Must Grow Biologic Corporation. Okay, and they're in the business of creating what they call safe and effective biopesticides. Okay, and they said they've salvaged banana crops, all kinds of things. But what I'm wondering is, what is the collateral aspects of this? Is it any danger on the, the insect population, such as bees and whatnot? And then the other thing I'd like to say is that FOE, they've played a tremendous role historically in regulation development. For example, at the time of the Montreal Protocol, one of the biggest obstacles we had to moving that treaty forward was the United Kingdom. Fiona Reconnell, as you will be aware of, said it'll never be an issue in the UK. And that was all trade protection for ICI. And we asked Friends of the Earth, I did ask Friends of the Earth to step in and make it an issue in the UK, and you did. And, and that really bombarded the opposition. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a cheer to Friends of the Earth and what they've done. Anyway.
Well, they work, but I'll take credit for it. Thanks. On behalf of all the Friends of the Earth.
Yeah. But you might want to look into this company just from the point of view of determining whether, all of their brand new produced products, they apparently don't have any of the historical drawbacks in terms of its impact on the collateral environment that the rest do. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, because I'm not a scientist working in that area in any way, shape, or form. That's it.
I'll be interested. I assume Pierre will be too. I wonder if they have anything registered yet.
Yeah.
Johnny boy, if I can just say something parenthetically
you certainly can.
I believe it's in the US, in the EU. Every year they have a conference on exactly the topic that Vic mentioned, called biopesticides. There has been huge advances in the science of biology that, so I'll spend a little more time looking for that and then forward it to B and maybe to you, John, or to the board, whatever. But the biopesticides is a big growth area in Europe. Unfortunately, in Canada, we have so little going on in the bioeconomy, but that's a potential solution there.
Can I just add a quick comment on that? Because this company was a new startup. I bought some of their stock at 67 cents. And over the last 6 months, it's now $3.50 a share. And it's growing rapidly. But I'm hoping that all they say is good and fingers up positively for the environmental impacts, which I know very little about, other than they've created new pesticide that saved all kinds of crops around the world from different problems.
Thank you, Vic. Pierre Minot, if you please. Pierre?
Yep, I'm trying to start my video also, and I also am being told I cannot start it because the host has stopped it. Anyway, here we go.
Host, can you please? There we go.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, just a quick comment there for Vic. There is nothing inherently safer about a pesticide because it happens to be a natural molecule. I mean, some of the best poisons that we have come from plants or derived from biological origins. Mm-hmm. The real difference that you could hope for in so let's call them biopesticides, is more specificity to the host, to the pest you're trying to control. So what we have, the real problem with pesticides is one of scale and economy. Companies are not willing to put pesticides that are only specific to one or two pest species. It can be done, usually with viruses, fungi, bacteria. It's happened in forestry because there was a huge amount of government money behind it. But typically you don't see that very much in agriculture because the cost of putting the molecule or the organism to market is such that it's not worth their while unless it's going to control a number of pests, a number of the world's crops. So what you have now is a system dominated by the economies of scale. You have seed companies that have been integrated with pesticide companies, and which is why we have that issue of prophylactic pesticides, where many of the farmers don't even realize they're actually using treated seed, and if they don't want to, don't often have the choice or very limited choice for untreated seed. So it's a huge economic problem. I'd say even before it's a biological problem. The whole issue of pesticides in agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Ted Manning. Your observations, please.
Hi, B. We haven't seen each other for ages, but I was at a conference a while back in Europe, and they went ballistic over GMOs, and they essentially they took over the conference with several thousand people who were trying to throw us out, who were trying to do reasonable environmental planning, or at least we thought so. It became very politically important, and quite frankly, it has much higher profile in Europe than it tends to have here. I was just going to ask, to what extent are the impacts of GMOs or any other playing around with the crops having on the bees? And further, who's in charge of looking at that?
Well, there is at Health Canada,
Mhm.
the just a couple of months ago, they finished a consultation on novel foods
Mhm.
that asked the question of whether the government should continue to play a role, a regulatory role,
Yeah.
or provide a voluntary instrument for food industry to deal with novel foods. So, this is where GMOs would be,
Yeah.
and some of the newer technologies beyond GMOs. Then, it's all connected, right? So the GMOs, then once it may go back 20 years, remember when they're first being introduced into farming and the marketplace, they then called for certain kinds of pesticides. I knew I couldn't get off this call without mentioning glyphosate.
Mhm.
So pesticides like glyphosate are used for crops that are genetically modified. It won't harm them, but it'll clobber the weeds around. And in many cases, resulting in pesticide resistance or super weeds or whatever. All the things we talked about 20 years ago, we have. So, you're right, the issues have never hit the same fervor here in Canada as they did in Europe. Glyphosate is up for renewal for registration in Europe next year. I mean, it's the consultation starting now, but it was a 5-year instead of a 15-year approval the last time. I believe it's up next year. In Canada, we're looking at glyphosate issues on what amount is acceptable. So maximum residue level, what's acceptable in the food you eat.
Yep.
And since they're using it more and more to dry down crops before they're harvested, we're seeing higher levels of residue in food like oatmeal, lentils, beans. If you're eating, vegetarian meat these days, you're eating peas and things like that probably have been dried down. There's desiccation by glyphosate, even though it's supposed to be used for weed management, not for desiccation. But anyway, so it's hard to separate out all these, but the basket of issues are at Health Canada. Obviously, Ag Canada has a bit to do, but they are pro anything GMO.
Yeah.
I would say that categorically, but in Health Canada, Environment Canada had a role in the past on novel foods. As far as I can see, it's all moved over to Health Canada. And, they're showing more and more that they prefer to be hands-off, which I just think is ridiculous. Even if you're going to continue with these kind of products, I believe you need regulatory oversight.
Yeah.
And we're not going to have it.
We keep finding out to our own distress that everything is interrelated, and trying to get systems of governance that will even can comprehend that, much less try and deal with it in a systematic way, tends to be a real challenge.
Well, it does. And also so many of the channels for, what we used to call consultation.
Yeah.
Still have consultation, but it's very prescribed. It's not engaged the way, where you talk about things before they were a fait accompli. You have a chance to discuss things. It's very, I'm going to say it's industry driven to a large extent. So take the MRLs I just mentioned.
Yeah.
These are I guess every country, but there's a global agency called Codex, and then every country has its own work on maximum residue levels. It's a trade instrument. So Bayer has asked Canada to increase the level of glyphosate residue, let's say in oatmeal, 250 times more or something like that. So it's, I forget the numbers, 30 parts per million now from where it is now, roughly. And so the consultation was set up. We put a stick in it by talking to the environment minister to say, hey, you have a role in this, where the hell are you? And then many people in Quebec got very exercised about glyphosate increasing in their food just before the election. So they put a pause on everything. And during the election, Health Canada or PMRA announced the consultation was closed. And so when they hit the button again in April or whenever it is, it'll just automatically go into place, the increase. So
Thank
there's-
you. I
Yeah,
shouldn't have asked that question. I may get into political trouble. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, I eat a lot of oatmeal.
Never touch this stuff. It's got food in it.
Yeah. Lentils, things like that.
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks, Ted. And I have one observation from Vic Buxton, or maybe several, but may we make that the last intervention, and then I'll turn to Jean to offer our thanks. So Victor, over to you.
Okay, thanks, John. Just to mention, many years ago, I was conscripted by the OECD to chair an international meeting on GMO and its dissipation globally. And some of the observations that come out of here were very, very interesting. Big opposition from the French to some of the American companies, and the American companies contended that they were worried about them selling seeds and whatnot, GMO seeds, in Europe, and therefore destroying their own markets, equivalent markets. And then the opposite side of that was, no, this is trying to preserve the status quo based on the strategic application of doubt. Then the environmentalists stepped forward and said, one of the problems with GMOs are they're created for a specific purpose. And that is to say, enhance the lumber type of wood you got or some other product in some way, but no one knows what the environmental consequences are. And least of all, the regulatory agencies. They didn't know what the impact would be on the habitat in general, yet they get introduced into the environment because of economic considerations. And that was my early comments about, the economics controls the world in many cases. And so I'm happy that there's still opposition to GMO unless we know enough about the full impact of the GMO to allow its introduction. Maybe B's got some observations on this.
Just another observation on that. It'll be very interesting to watch Mexico in the coming year because Mexico has banned the use of glyphosate. This is in the interest of preserving their heritage corn. I believe they banned GM corn a couple of years ago, maybe. But the glyphosate was a separate issue, apparently. So, within our trade area, Canada, US, and Mexico, this kind of ban means, according to our agreement to harmonize upward, you guys remember that, on our trade agreement. So if Mexico is not challenged, and they are being challenged now by Bayer, but if they hold on to this decision to ban glyphosate, I think so it's that package. They want their own corn, they don't want GM corn, they don't want one of the main pesticides that's used with it, so the glyphosate. It gives us an opportunity to ask some questions about, okay, they're there, we're supposed to harmonize upward, not downward. What are we going to do in glyphosate? It's how about, you must be like this too, Vic, but in your life, you have some things that stick with you. And for me, pulp and paper effluent and certain chemicals. So CFCs and methyl bromide. I skipped the ones in between, and now it's Neonics and glyphosate. And it's like my whole career is wrapped up in these bloody pesticides. Chemicals. The more we learn about glyphosate and its impact on your microbiome, your digestion, and its linkages with brain matters, with Parkinson, with other kind of neuro diseases, I think the story has still to be written on its impact on human health. It is frightening. So
this is my biggest problem. They get introduced before we know enough about the impact to adequately develop control. And we haven't got the scientific dollars to even investigate the impact before they're allowed on the market.
Yeah. And is there adequate independent research before decisions are made on what is being registered or allowed in the market? And if we don't have independent research, we're just going to get what industry has bought and paid for in the way of research. So, you know, we got to break that cycle somewhere.
Jean, I'm going to invite Raymond Lurie to make a counterpoint on GMO, and then I'll come back to you to thank and liberate Bee to go back to working for her real her having spent a couple of hours with us. So, Raymond, would you like to make your point?
So I thought I had made it on the chat, but my point is that scientifically speaking, there's really no reason to think that GMOs or using GMO techniques to breed plants is any different than breeding plants any other way. There was a comment earlier, I can't remember who it is that made the comment that
It was Pierre.
Yeah, about the natural products that
yes, he was talking about curare, that the most dangerous toxins are in fact from biological origins.
Yeah, so when you do traditional plant breeding, you're introducing some changes that you hope will make it to the plant that you breed, but you also introduce a host of other changes that you're not aware of, that you're not intending to introduce, and those could be as bad, if not worse, than what you would introduce from a GMO process. A GMO process is there to introduce one specific trait as precisely as possible without introducing any other nefarious or bad traits that may happen to come along with the two daughter species if you're doing traditional breeding. So there's really no reason from a scientific point to think that GMOs are any worse than anything else. So applying tests that aren't applied to traditional breeding of plants really doesn't make sense from a scientific point of view. The argument of a glyphosate and all that, that's a totally separate thing, but the actual technique is simply a more efficient and effective breeding technique that's been developed through scientific means. So the opposition to GMOs, in my opinion, is a big problem, especially for us here, and I'll be, I know I'm not going to make friends here, but especially for us here in the West who have all the money we need to buy, natural, organic, or whatever food that we want. But in the end, at the end of the line, there's someone, if we have less productive crops, there's someone at the end of the line who's not eating. It's not us, but there's someone somewhere else, usually in a poor country, that's not eating, or forests that are being deforested in Brazil to make more room for more plants. And so there's consequences. So I think that the whole movement from the environmental movement to be against GMOs is misguided.
Okay, thank you very much. The chemical bonds are the same no matter how they're made, I guess. So, Jean, may I invite you to come on?
Yes, and I will add to that Beatrice had put in the chat line, the real concern, a major concern with GMOs is the fact that in many cases they're trying to cross species boundaries when they're introducing genetic components from one species to another. When you're doing genetic modification from within one species, it's less of an issue because it's basically speeding up breeding. Anyway, that's just my take, and I agree with what Beatrice had put into the chat line. Anyway, on that note, I would really like to, on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I would like to thank Beatrice for her thought-provoking discussion that she led with respect to the bees and the safety of and the future of the planet and food supplies that we might be facing in the future. It's really quite interesting, and it has been a very good discussion. So thank you very much. And for everyone who is attending this particular presentation for KCOR, I would like to direct you to our website at canadiancore.com. And if you're interested in this, looking at this video or any of the other videos that we've had on our Zoom sessions or any other the discussion papers that we've had, they're all available on our website, and you can go and look at that anytime you want. In addition to that, any of you who would like to join our organization, you can find the information again on our website, and we would encourage you to do that. And if you do wish to go and look at the videos that we have, we would encourage you to subscribe. It's free of charge. There's nothing there. It will help us, though. It will push us further up the search engines, as it were, and make it easier to find us. So on that behalf of that, Beatrice, thank you very, very much.